Welcome, everybody. My name is Forrest Meggers. I'm jointly appointed faculty between Architecture and the Andlinger Center, and it is my super wonderful, amazing pleasure to get to introduce one of my heroes, Gail Breger from UC Berkeley. Gail is going to help you guys understand why or why not you might be comfortable today with her talk, which is something that I think we often don't appreciate how much of an opportunity we have to improve our environment for ourselves while also improving it for the planet. And I think she is one of the foremost thought leaders on this for a very long time. She started as faculty when she was 10 years old, I think she told me today.
40 years ago,
Yeah.
10 years old.
Yeah. And yeah, since the very beginning, she's been rethinking comfort. The adaptive comfort model is something we use in my lab all the time. And so it's fun to have your heroes here whose shoulders you stand on, and I'm really looking forward to hear her talk and learn more about the amazing book she just published, which I think we'll all get to hear more about shortly.
Well,
Thanks,
thank
Gail.
you, Forrest. Can everybody hear me okay? And can up there hear me okay? Getting a thumbs up, I think. So I'm excited to be here, and as Forrest said, to talk about my new book, which is about 7 years in the making. And the book is essentially about how to enrich the human experience of architecture. And it's aimed at bridging the more data-driven language of science and engineering, which is my own background. I have 3 degrees in mechanical engineering before I went to the dark side, and I've been teaching in the Department of Architecture for 40 years. So we're trying to bridge my language with the more poetic sensorial language of the architect, which is the discipline I've been working in and is also the discipline of my co-author. So I want to begin by framing this work in the context of the climate crisis. I have spent a significant majority of my professional career trying to mitigate the climate crisis by thinking and doing research and teaching about how we can change building, design, and operational strategies to both reduce energy use and carbon emissions and also improve comfort and general human response to the indoor environmental quality. And I believe and I argue that these are inseparable. You cannot have a high-performing, low-energy building that creates a really horrible experience for thermal comfort and other attributes of the indoor environment. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to replicate the strategies that you incorporated to save energy, and you're not going to have the transformative effect that we need on the environment. Now, and the other reason they're linked is that it turns out a lot of building owners might not care about energy, but they will care, hopefully, about the experience for the people in their buildings. So in some way, I consider this approach trickery and deception, which means that I'm trying to still save energy, but I'm doing it by forefronting experiences of people. So I'd like to tell you about 3 things that have motivated and inspired me and really gotten me on this journey towards this work. So the first thing is probably like a lot of you, I have a profound love of nature. And I also believe and have seen in the literature that there's a strong connection between our experiences of nature and environmental stewardship. That we tend to care for things and people that we love. So if we can have more experiences of nature, then maybe we will care more about it, and hopefully we will take care of the planet. And so my argument is that those nature connections have to happen in both our outdoor and our indoor lives. So a second motivation for me is an interest and love for bioclimatic, biophilic buildings, buildings that respond to the natural climate, because not only are they going to save energy, but they are also going to connect us to these qualities of the climate and to the natural environment that have the potential to bring us joy, qualities of light and thermal experiences and sounds and smells. So here again, the bioclimatic buildings are a really good way of bridging both the need to save energy and improve environments for people. And the third motivation is my research group, which is an important foundation for this work. So the Center for the Built Environment, we have for decades been doing research that is good for both the planet and for people. So we look at building design and operational strategies and develop technologies that are going to both save energy and reduce carbon emissions and also improve the indoor environmental quality and human response to those conditions. So there's a wide range of technical work that we've done that is not going to be the details of my talk today. It's not that kind of a talk, but you'll see some glimmers of some of the work we do in this talk. But it was certainly a motivation for it. And we are a consortium of research group, which is both faculty and permanent research staff and postdocs and visiting scholars, and of course, our absolutely wonderful students and industry partners. We have nearly 50 industry partners, and by design, they represent diverse stakeholders in the building industry. So there are architects and engineers and developers, manufacturers, utilities, government agencies, large business owners. And so our work is very applied. We're trying to make a real difference in real buildings. And we do that through developing technologies, developing a lot of design tools that are free, online, open source. We have a post-occupancy survey tool that's one of the largest databases available. And we do publications, but we're also trying to influence industry through these design tools and also influencing green building rating systems and standards. But I always kind of felt that there was still something missing, right? So I am now in my 40th year teaching at UC Berkeley, and I've always done the traditional science and engineering route and published a lot of scientific papers and done these design tools and standards, but I still felt like I wasn't having a big enough impact. And so this book in some ways represents me getting out of my own comfort zone and trying to find a way to communicate more directly to the people who are creating the buildings where I'm trying to make a difference. And to do it, I felt like we were, the scientific publications, by necessity, were using a lot of conventional methods of analysis and representation and communication. And I felt like we were kind of missing some more nuanced ways of creating soulful architecture that are going to affect people. So that is what led to my journey. So the book is essentially about how architecture is the link between the natural environment, our indoor environments, and our experience. And I love the way Adlin Darling describes their work, the designer of this project, and I want to make sure I get the quote right, that they describe this project as a place to promote personal renewal and well-being, where landscape and architecture integrate to replenish and invigorate the spirit. I love that. I wish more architects talked in that way. Right? So I think we all know what architecture is. So what I want to do next is kind of unpack what I mean by nature, by environment, and by experience. Those are pretty broad, vague words. So let's see what I mean by that. Let's start with nature. Some of you may have heard the term biophilia, which is essentially translated as philia, love of nature, natural things, right? Our innate tendency to love nature. And biophilic design is about using architecture to try to strengthen those nature connections. Now, there's a lot of theories. I could teach a whole class just on biophilic design. There's a lot of theories about why nature is important to us. This diagram we created illustrates just some of them. So the top one, attention restoration theory. I think there's my dot. So attention restoration theory is about the cognitive benefits of nature. and it's about how connections to nature tend to affect the prefrontal cortex activity and the kind of mental fatigue that happens from sustained attention. It helps relax that, redirect attention, and allows us to then have an ability to refocus. So the cognitive benefits. And stress reduction theory, shown on the bottom here, is more about the physiological and emotional benefits of nature. And this research has shown that, that connections to nature actually lowers our heart rate variability, which is a measure of stress. It creates a more calm state. It's been compared to almost like an awake, eyes open meditation state. And it can have the potential for reduced long-term chronic effects that come from stress. So what do I mean by environment? I'm talking about the sensescapes, the sensory elements of the environment that affect our sensory systems. And my argument here is that architects generally think about the geometric dimensions of space, but I like to think about sensescapes where the experience of space is not defined by the geometry, but by the sensory qualities themselves. So whether you're standing and huddled in the shady part of the Spanish Steps in Rome, right? Or maybe you're huddled under this incredible petal-shaped structure of Zaha Hadid's Art and Cultural Center in China and watching the movement of sky and light. Or how many people have been in Pike's Market in Seattle? You move through the flower section, and from there you move to the fish section, right? Your olfactory sense is what is defining these spaces. The walls don't even exist for you. Or maybe you're in this luxurious wine cellar and tasting room, and the unique resonance of that space creates an auditory experience. So I want you to play along with me for a moment. I want you to imagine for a moment, what would life be like if you ate the same foods at every meal, if you never had weather or changing sky conditions, if you listened to monotone sounds, you did not have music or bird songs, there was no art in your life to delight your visual senses, I think we can all agree that would be pretty awful. But that is essentially what we are doing in our indoor spaces when we almost intentionally create these static, uniform conditions that do not change. Right? How many people have maybe worked in a space like this? Yeah. I call this experiential monotony. And the irony is, it's actually incredibly energy intensive to create these conditions. But it does not have to be that way. So the book begins with what we call transformations. Transformation from conventional realities that, I will say, often start with good intentions, but fall short of creating an experiential richness that is really missing in contemporary built environments. So these 5 pieces of the puzzle. The first one I call neutrality fallacy. This is the idea that neutral conditions are the ideal. That if we design buildings that don't change, where nobody complains, where nobody even notices, that is considered success. And instead, I argue that vitality should be the experiential target. Our buildings are increasingly disconnecting us from nature. Large sealed buildings, windows that don't open, big floor plates, right? And we're spending 90% of our time indoors, it's estimated. So there's this big disconnect, and instead we're arguing that buildings should do the opposite. And given how much time we spend indoors, they should aspire to creating an affinity with nature. Conditioning monarchy refers to the idea that in most contemporary buildings, centralized lighting, heating, and cooling rule. And we are passive recipients of these environments that are created by machines. And instead, we should move towards a democracy of control that gives people individual agency and empowers people to have some control and choice over their environmental conditions. And all of this has led to an addiction to air conditioning, where year by year, our ability to live without it diminishes. And yes, we do need air conditioning, but I'm arguing that we need it when and where that's needed, and it needs to be supplemented with the healthy delight of gourmet thermal experiences. And sadly, all of this is being supported by universal standards, which start with this basic assumption that we are all the same and we should design for the average person, and instead we need to move towards differential flexibility, where we recognize people as individuals and look at cultural differences. Now, the word experience, boy, talk about vague, especially coming from an engineering background. As I started moving into the world of wanting to learn about experience, I found it both fascinating and befuddling. I like preciseness, right? There wasn't a lot of preciseness. There wasn't a lot of language. There wasn't a lot of understanding about what do we actually mean by experience. We all have it every moment of our lives, but the design industry does not really have a language for talking about it, and that is a big purpose of this book. So let me try to tell you just a few ways we tried to frame ideas of experience. Okay? So I like to usually start with the science, even while understanding it's only going to give us a part of the puzzle. So for the most part, when we experience the environment, it starts with environmental conditions that stimulate our sensory organs that then send signals to the different brain regions. And this response usually starts with sensation. Hot, cold, bright, dim. Right? It's not something we really think about. It just is. It's a signal. But what designers may actually be more interested in is the idea of perception. How do you feel about it? Right? Is it warm or cold? Okay. But is that annoying or pleasurable? Is it positive or negative? That's perception, that's affect. That's what we really care about, right? Do you like it? So another way we tried to unpack this body-mind state of experience is with this nested complexity. So this idea that I just talked about is sensation and affect are on the left side, and as you move to the right, more complex states are built on the simpler ones. So when you move beyond that, you've got understanding, which might come with time. It might come with understanding the natural cycles of climate. And finally, affiliation, which is about connection. And we don't often connect or care about things that we don't understand. It makes it harder. And understanding and affiliation are more connected to a sense of place, but designers often have control of the elements that are going to affect the simpler responses. Now, another way we like to think about it is this reinterpretation of Maslow's hierarchy, which says you start at the bottom with your basic needs before you go up. So the bottom two levels are all about the necessity of reducing the negative. These are for thermal experiences, but you can think about them for other senses. So the bottom is about avoiding heat and cold stress, or having buildings be habitable in the case of a power outage. It's about resilience, right? The next level up, comfort. This is where most of our buildings operate. It's the basis for a lot of building science research, for standards. Many of you might be familiar with ASHRAE Standard 55. Anybody's heard of that, about that? This is about defining a comfort zone, a set of conditions in which 80% of the occupants will find them comfortable. 80%. Let's think about that for a moment. What if you were a manufacturer and your goal is that no more than 20% of your customers were pissed off about your product. You'd be out of business. Or if you were a restaurant owner and no more than 20% of your Yelp reviews were about complaints, you'd be out of business. But that's how aspirational we get in our buildings. And our surveys have shown we're not even hitting that. So this work is about how do we go beyond just comfort? How do we go beyond reducing the negative? And how do we do more to enhance the positive? And one of our arguments is that the key to moving upward is about creating rich, variable, multisensory, biophilic environments. And by variability, we can think about that spatially, right? How are things like a little bit non-uniform, or as you move between spaces, or temporally, do you connect to things changing over time? And this is a great place, I think, to introduce one of my absolutely favorite words, which is anesthesia. Now, how many people have actually heard this word, anesthesia? All right. How many people have heard it from somebody other than me? You've never heard me talk, so you've probably heard it from somebody other than me, right? I ask all of you to try to use this word 3 times this year. I'm trying to spread the wisdom. Anesthesia is basically the physiological essence of thermal delight. And it's about the temporal nature of the thermoreceptors in our skin. We have a static and temporal component. The static component is what makes us feel generally hot, cold. The temporal component is the dynamic component, is more about what gives us this higher level of pleasure. So this is a diagram we created to try to illustrate this. The idea is that this can be about either contrast over parts of our skin, or it can be contrast over time. The top bar represents the ambient environment, going from neutral in the middle to cold and hot at the ends. The next bar is the contrast, or what us nerds call corrective stimulus. And that goes in the opposite direction of extremes, hot to cold. And then the third bar says that the greater the difference, the greater the potential for anesthesial pleasure. Now, this could be as simple as when you hold a warm cup of coffee on a cold day. Simple, small. That exact same cup of coffee at that exact same temperature is going to feel different if you're holding it on a hot day, right? That's affect, that's perception. Do you like it or do you not like it? Now, the extremes in these pictures are hopefully things that we've all experienced in our recreational lives, right? A hot tub on a cold night, jumping into a cold river on a hot day. But many of these schemas are about trying to create more moderate levels of anesthesia, of pleasure, enhancing the positive within the built environment. It could be a sun-baked window on a cold day. It could be walking into a lobby with a strong fan after you've been walking or riding your bike to work on a hot day and your tissue is soaked in body heat, right? And you want that instant relief. So with that introduction, I would like to give you a high-level overview of the book. And the book is organized in these 5 chapters. I should say something about the cover image. I love the mystery of this. This is a meditation hall in Korea done by the Japanese architect Tadao Ando. And I love how there's this mystery of this slit of light in the dome-shaped roof of this underground space where the angle of the light and the ambiance is going to change throughout the day. And it's a space he describes to discover oneself. So the chapters after the introduction, my co-author was primarily responsible for chapter 2. He's the architectural theorist, looks at Ken Wilber's integral theory as a way of making sense of experience. I got to nerd out ever so briefly in chapter 3, excited by evidence, and talk about the science of sensory systems with a particular emphasis on how they respond to variability. And the heart of the book is chapter 4, which is what I'd like to talk about now. So what is this experiential design schema. An experiential design schema is the organization of form and space that intentionally, that's key, intentionally orchestrates environmental conditions to create positive human experiences. It's not about reducing the negative. Lots of info out there about that. This is all about enhancing the positive. We've developed 45 schemas for this book, and every one of them has a consistent format. So the first spread, pages 1 and 2, describe the phenomena, have a couple of elegant precedents. Pages 3 and 4 provide research evidence about how that affects us and some design guidelines. And then you'll see these navigational icons on the right side of the book, and the top ones describe these distributions of conditions. These are about how conditions are organized in space and time, which are like the ingredients, the elements of variability. And I'm going to be describing each one of these to you with examples of schemas momentarily. So the book is organized not by the traditional chapters of light, sound, thermal, smells, even though it's all in there. It's organized by these distributions of conditions, which are shown in the matrix and the columns. And it's also coded by scale. And scale is important because we experience things at scale, and we also design at scale. The book is richly illustrated with about 170 photos of spaces that range from scale to setting, residential to commercial, civic to everyday spaces. And we also have about 130 original illustrations done by our wonderful students who are so much more graphically inclined than I am. And we have 3 types of these diagrams, either conceptual or frameworks of ideas. I already showed you one of them, the biophilic diagram. We redraw a lot of research evidence in ways that we think about how can we change the way it's presented to really convey the essential message. So they're often a little bit different than what you might find in the research publications. And then we have a number of diagrams which provide guidelines or typologies about, well, how do you actually do this? All right, so let's look at these different categories. Right? Contrast. Contrast is a distribution of conditions which are opposing conditions, and it can either be experienced simultaneously or in rapid succession. And these pictures illustrate one of my favorite example schemas called Engage the Rain. And this idea is about, rather than, oh, it's raining, I have to go hide inside and separate myself, how can you have both indoor and outdoor experiences where you've got some protection, you're dry, but you can still hear and see and smell the rain and feel the moisture and feel the breeze. Thermal enclave is about getting away from the uniformity and creating a subspace where the conditions are intentionally different than the larger ambient space. And it can be a small zone, a larger zone, but it's really about spatial contrast. And Frank Lloyd Wright's Winslow House does this in a cold climate where this thermal enclave of an ingle nook is across from the main entrance, and it's both raised and narrowed compared to the general space. It's enclosed with this arcade screen. It's got these cushioned benches and heat-storing brick wraps. The ceiling is lowered a little bit. So it's a way to accentuate both the physical, social, and psychological sense of warmth. And this is an example of what some of the design typology diagrams we've created. In this case, the top row is how to create pockets of warm thermal enclaves in a cold environment, or in the bottom, it's how to create cooler pockets in a warm environment. And each of these is based on an actual architectural case study that's described in the caption, but we've tried to sketch out the essence of how you create that. Haptic connection is a way to create contrast across different parts of the body and use direct thermal connection to create a sense of warmth or coolness. So St. Salo Town Hall by Alvar Aalto does this with these warmed benches next to this cooler window, so it allows you to have kind of a warm seat and a cooler upper body and experience that difference in an intentional way that brings pleasure. This is an example of some research done at CBE where we did mapping of the thermal sensitivity of different body parts. And it shows that if you're going to do haptic connection, that if you're trying to provide warmth, our body parts have different sensitivity, that providing warmth to the buttocks or the hands and feet are going to be very effective, whereas if you're providing cooling, the face is most effective, such as the effect of a cool breeze. We've also done a lot of research in developing this heated and cooled chair. So we all have the pleasure of heated seats in our cars. This is both heating and cooling, but with separate controls for the back and for the seat. So we've even seen some people do this not just for thermal control, but you've got a sore back and you want to put the heat on there and you have a cool butt to kind of balance things out, right? And we have found through our lab and field studies that we have found incredibly high levels of satisfaction across, given a 20-degree Fahrenheit ambient temperature range with very low amounts of energy. Okay, the second distribution, gradients, instead of sharp contrast, this is about relatively smooth transitions between one condition and another. So this is an example of a schema we call shades of brilliance, where there's very large pergola shading, which provides, depending on time of day, either full sun, partial shade, or full shade, all generally within one's field of perception, and with movable furniture so you can move around and decide where you want to sit. Or an acoustic gradient schema, euphonic water, is about creating various intensities of acoustics, and in this case also coolness, as you move closer to the source. So this example of Paley Park is this oasis in New York where these calming sounds of the waterfall really mask the frenetic street life noises above. And there's a lot of work out there about the cognitive benefits of water sounds. These are just a couple of examples that we've included. The ones on the left show that sounds of water actually improve people's creative thinking and creative tasks compared to these six other sources of sound. And the right one is these urban soundscape semantic profiles that showed not only the obvious, that sounds of water were more pleasurable than different traffic sounds, but they also studied the unique psychoacoustic profile of different sounds, so we can give designers suggestions about how fountains versus pools versus running water actually has different kind of sound characteristics that affect us. Zephyr Spectrum is named after the gentle, the god of the gentle west wind. And this is not just about air movement per se, it's about the experience of creating a range, a spectrum of breezy and calm places that people can move between. So this example does things outside through these series of open courtyards and external walkways. Or the right side is a rare example of a naturally ventilated hospital, and they'll have jalousie windows and vents in the wall and these balconies, and it's a way to enable people to have a range of conditions that they can experience. And some of CBE's research shown on the left found that in contrast to the standards that previously said, oh no, we need still conditions, the reasons they said that is that they put people in laboratory conditions, they blew air at the back of their neck, they asked them if they liked it, the people said no, and then the standard said, oh, air movement is bad. Well, if you study things in more realistic conditions, you find that people actually like air movement, not just because they want to be made more comfortable when they're too warm, but they often like air movement for it itself because it gives them a sense of refreshment. Okay? So you need to give people choice and control over that. And then the image on the right is showing that it's not just about air velocity, but it's the type of air movement, the patterns that make a difference. And it shows that people overwhelmingly like the patterns of the natural wind compared to the sinusoidal patterns of a predictable fluctuating fan, and constant air motion was actually the least desirable. All right, the next distribution, rhythms, is about connecting us to nature's natural cycles, which is an essential part of biophilic design. This schema, part of Dawn and Dusk, shows this wonderful home in Greece where the rooms are oriented to the east and the west so you can be aligned with the color and light changes of sunrise and sunset, and also see these wonderful views of sky and water from either inside or on the terrace. Forrest, I think field trip next week? Yeah? You're in? All right. Now, where Zephyr Spectrum was about air movement, but was specifically about a range, aperture engagement is related, but is at the scale of the person. It's about giving people control over that climatic relationship of the facade. And I love the tectonics of Tom Kudig's work. This particular one, in order to open up this window wall, there's a hand crank, right? It's very tactile. And this hand crank then has a counterweight and a series of gears and pulleys and allows the person to directly engage with the opening of the wall. Visual environment, we did this illustration to illustrate both the physical and experiential patterns of natural daylight throughout the day, which are two strong elements that influence our circadian health. One is that, of course, the intensity of the light changes, being low in the mornings and evenings and going to a higher intensity in the afternoon. But the second pattern is that color temperature changes, being lower or the warm reds in the morning and evening, going to a higher color temperature or cool blue in the middle of the day. And this has an immediate effect on our hormones. So middle of the day, melatonin is suppressed, serotonin is elevated, the opposite in the morning and evening. And this affects our alertness, it affects our sleep-wake cycles, our mood, and other biological functions. So the schema circadian health, circadian space addresses this at two different scales. Rick Joy's apartment in this very narrow sidelit apartment in New York enables people with different sleep habits to inhabit the room. Instead of darkening the entire room, the bed itself is in the back of the room and enveloped with this double curtain with a black inner side and a reflective outer side. Or at the commercial scale in the northern latitude of Seattle, with shorter winter days, people can get their circadian stimulus while still at work by having daylit perimeter offices or having these social spaces that go into this brightly lit atrium. The next distribution, flux, is about stochastic or random patterns. Think like blowing leaves in the wind or the changing patterns of a thunderstorm. This is a wonderful project where the light reflects off of the water and onto the surfaces. And then as the wind blows across the water, those light patterns dance on the surfaces. So you're animating the architecture through the reflections off of water. Another favorite schema of mine is called melodic materials. And this is where you're translating the natural forces of wind and rain into the sound. So it's particularly about the acoustic experience. So on the left, this wind museum in South Korea, wind itself is the exhibit. And it's got these walls with slats, which enables the wind to either whisper or howl, depending on the weather. Or or the rain hearing pavilion, which is designed to just sit and listen to either the rain falling on the tile roof, the stone floor, or the basin as it fills. Now, CBE does a lot of research on the role of air movement for comfort, and fans in particular. This schema, Fans First, is about an operational strategy. How do we integrate fans with air conditioning? And it's the idea where instead of the conventional approach, it starts to get warm, let's just turn on the air conditioning. When it gets warm, you start moving the air first. First at a lower speed. As it gets a little warmer, the speed of the fan increases, it gets warmer still. Sure, turn on the air conditioning. But if you do that with increased air motion, the air conditioning set point can be lowered, and you can have a really lovely combination of low energy comfort control. The next distribution sequence is specifically about people moving between spaces. So light and dark procession is illustrated by the historic Hill House in Scotland, where people enter a very dark entry with dark wood paneling. You then move into the diffusely lit stair area with the northern windows, and from there you move into the dining and living area, which is south-facing and has windows on 3 sides, and is very brightly lit and energized. Or an olfactory sequence, aromatic transit is specifically about the olfactory experience of moving from one space to another and through this threshold. So it's about passageways. On the left, either exterior, this wonderful wisteria pergola that connects you from a lookout point at the far end to stairs to your residence behind you, or this lobby space in San Francisco where there's a living wall with fragrances that change throughout the year, and it's both open to the public for them to go from outside into this space. That's one threshold. Or it's also for the employees that move in and out of this space in their way to the deeper office space on a daily basis. And a classic example is the Kimball Art Museum, which we use to illustrate ingress transitions, which is essentially about a sequence going from outdoors to indoors. And this is where Kahn has masterfully choreographed these sensory experiences from the very harsh outdoor environment to the more subdued indoor environment. And this is a great example of the difference between thermal and visual transitions. Visually, our eyes adapt very slowly when you go from bright to dim. So visually, you need to help people adapt to that architecturally by having longer passageways, longer travel time, decreasing sense of enclosure. Whereas thermally, it can be much more abrupt. That's what the anesthesia was about, going from the hot outside to the cool indoors. So you really want to think about our sensory systems and how they each need adaptation time. And the very last distribution I want to tell you about, narrative, is the idea that it's less about how things are distributed in space and time, and it's more about having to have some metaphoric or symbolic story to help you understand that experience. So this one, Three Realms, is illustrated by Antoine Predoc's Turtle Creek House, where you enter the lower left there in the realm of the ground, and you have this lower entry that feels like you're moving into a stone cave. And then you go to the ground realm, where there's these observation decks, and the forest starts to open up. And then that opens to the sky realm, where you have this incredible, a walkway here that projects out into the trees. And even from that, there's another level that goes up to the sky to be able to contemplate the stars. And my last two schemas I want to show as part of narrative are both about how do we collect rainwater, but how do you actually convey a message about how the architecture is doing that, and in a way that even on a dry day, you can visualize, you can imagine how that rainwater is being collected with the promise of the moisture yet to come. And finally, this is an example of another typology diagram we've created that is particularly about connecting the physical strategy of design to the experience, so that not only can you visually see from the outside how the roof is shaped to collect the water, but even from underneath, you can look up and there's a story about how that roof is doing something functionally, but beyond just giving you shelter. So with that, I hope that I have changed the way you think, not only maybe about your own work, but even in about the spaces that you inhabit, and can maybe have some influence in your own ways to make it more delightful for all of you. So with that, thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions. Questions, comments, your own experiences, aha moments.
Yes, thank you very much. You sure don't sound like a mechanical engineering person to me.
Thank you. That's the best compliment. It's taken
I'm
a
very
long
relaxed
time.
after seeing this. But two things. One is the interdisciplinary nature of your work, the social science, economic science, medical science, et cetera. And two is we already have a humongous built environment, which, according to what I just saw, is not necessarily healthy in itself. So retrofitting these things, these office buildings, for example, and as you may know, downtown areas today after COVID, these buildings are empty. So how do you improve the health of these buildings, and in some sense draw people back out into a more social situation, which would be healthy for society as well?
I love that question. I heard a lot of different things in there. I heard retrofit of existing buildings, also adaptive reuse of existing buildings where you're actually changing their function, changing offices into housing, and also bringing people back to shared spaces. So we spent so much time just isolated, and I think it's really important that we come back together. I think one way to do that is to start with the collective spaces, the social spaces, rather than the private spaces. That what does it take to bring people together, and in spaces that just feel good? You grab your lunch, and where are you going to sit in the office space? You're going to go back to your office, or is there a place that you can be? I think an important part, you mentioned the economics, is we need to find ways to do this that don't take a lot of money. And I firmly believe that that's the case. My students, I taught a class called Sensory Space, and a lot of their case studies, they went and they found projects and mapped schemas to projects like affordable housing and community centers, and the idea that we need to do this in everyday spaces. In the book, we needed beautiful photographs, so those tend to be Starchitect kind of projects, but I firmly believe we need to do this in our everyday spaces. Yes?
Thanks very much. So I guess one nested question within another. So number one is the primary way to support all of these schemas, to justify them, is to basically do occupancy surveys. And then number two, are occupancy surveys potent enough to make developers and building clients actually decide to spend a little more to invest in their buildings to make them better?
Okay, so you're talking my language here. I'm a big fan of post-occupancy surveys because I think if you want to know how buildings are working for people, you need to ask the people. So then the question, so I think those are really important. That's about existing buildings, but how do we take those lessons back to design of buildings that don't exist yet? But let's take the existing buildings and learn what's working. We have found that they really do help building owners decide where to prioritize, because you can't do everything. And so if you're going to put money into improving something, what the surveys will let you do is help you understand what's working, what's not working. And one of the reasons I think surveys are important is that if you just look at the traditional method of finding out what's not working, which is phone calls to the facility manager, people tend to pick up the phone and make complaints only when there's something negative, and it's about something that you think can be changed. So we used to think that thermal complaints were the number one complaint in building, because that's why people would make a call. But when you do surveys, you actually get a very different picture. And that's where we find that the acoustic environment is actually more of a problem in office buildings. But people weren't complaining because they didn't think anything could be done. So I think the surveys are really valuable because you can get more nuance and you can be more broad. Yes?
Thank you so much for your talk. I'm studying how does anesthesia happens outdoors for pedestrians when they're moving through urban spaces. And some questions that I'm wondering about is the level of pleasure equal to the level of displeasure, to the discomfort, right? Because to create pleasure, we need a certain degree of displeasure. And how often do we need to introduce that pleasurable island of relief in the city, to maintain that overall pleasurable state? I just wonder whether you have any idea.
Those are great questions. I think there's actually a lot more opportunities for this, I'll say first in general, in outdoor environments because you're moving through them. Whereas if you're in your office space and you're sitting there for longer periods of time, it's just a different exposure. So we often talk about two kinds of anesthesia. One is temporal anesthesia, which is about a change over time, and that's about walking from the outside into a cooler lobby, for example. And spatial anesthesia, although I don't like that term because architects think spatial, physical space, we use it, it's almost like an asymmetric anesthesia. It's about contrast over the skin. It's about holding the cup of coffee. It's about a breeze on your face. It's about sitting in the hot and cold chair. What we have found that temporal anesthesia, you do need to be a little bit uncomfortable, not a lot uncomfortable, for you to get that moment, right? So there needs to be a little bit, I'm not in the neutral zone, but the asymmetric over parts of your body, I think, have more design opportunities, particularly for indoors, because that can be more sustained. You don't have to be uncomfortable for that pleasure to happen.
Thank you. A book that had a really big impact on me years ago, the title is Suburban Nation. It's the Platter, Zybeck, I think it was written about 20 years ago. I guess you're not familiar with it.
No, who wrote it?
It's the, I have it here. Well,
I'm going to look it up.
He's looking it up, and what I want to say is I actually never intended to live in a suburban home, but I live in Princeton, but I live about 2.5 miles from here. And I think there's a lot that needs to be done. That their work has something to do with how we live. And, there's a huge amount of, lawns and places where you really aren't ever going to have mass transit, I don't think. But I really wonder, because I don't know that part of the pleasure of living there is the nature piece.
Right.
So I just wonder if I struggle with, I just living here in Princeton, I feel like I might want to live on Pine Street, except I kind of like being able to look at the sky at night and really seeing the stars. I remember, lying in the backyard with my kids in July and looking at the fireflies. So I sort of struggle, there's a tension for me and yet, the farther away houses are, somewhat, you connect with people somewhat less. I know that's true. So I don't know what the question is, except what do you think about this, I guess?
You're making me think of a great presentation I saw just a couple weeks ago. I went to the Biophilic Leadership Summit, and one of my favorite presentations was about this research that's being done about showing that there isn't a conflict between density and urban green space. And there used to be this idea that, yes, we need density and people are moving to the cities and we need to reduce the footprint, but people want to live in the suburbs because houses are further apart and you have more nature. And there's people who are doing wonderful work showing that you can have both density and green space in the cities and different ways to do that. And it could be a combination of high density and then larger parks. It could be interstitial green spaces that are woven between. And they actually did the numbers on it, and I like numbers. So they were integrating both the design and quantification of how do you have this sweet spot. And I think we can do both. And I think, but a big part also is not just whether you're in suburban environments or whether you're in the city. It's not just how do we interweave the outdoor green spaces with density, which is what you made me think of, but also how do we design our buildings and our windows and our spaces to hang out so that we can connect with that. And it can be as simple, even in existing spaces. Where do you sit to have your morning cup of coffee, and where do you inhabit your building, your own home in the evening? And so it's not just about the design, it's inhabitation, and how do we change the way we move through our own spaces to create that connection. So it's both outdoors and indoors.
I'm not in the field in any way. I'm actually a postdoc in biology here.
But you inhabit buildings, right?
Yes.
Okay, good. You're
So
in the field.
to that, I guess what I'm curious about is what strategies, I guess, or ways have you seen that was successful in convincing, for example, like we work anyway, right? And how you convince, for example, an institution, right, or a university or a school that a certain space or office needs to be redesigned to have this experiential experience? Or have you seen any successful cases
How do you
that...
get people to do this, right? Okay, so the
Yes.
first thing is you got to know your audience, because some people, some building owners, clients are going to already be, oh, we need a sustainable building, and then your argument is about, okay, you've already set that as a goal. How do you communicate that energy and experience go hand in hand and are part of the goals that you've already established? So it's about the language you use, and it's about connecting it to goals and priorities that they've already set. And a lot of it depends on the building type. If you're in an office building, for example, and let's say the building owner doesn't really care about energy, and let's say they really don't even care about people's experience, but they care about money. Oh, okay, well, that's my audience. I can use the argument about recruitment and retention of employees, big money impact. You can talk about the impact on health and productivity, big money impact. Now, there's a group called Terrapin Bright Green and Bill Browning, who does a lot of work on biophilic design, and they just came out with their second edition of a free publication on their website called The Economics of Biophilic Design. And they gathered all of the research and looking at the financial implications of doing this so that you can talk to people who don't care about your values, but they do care about money. And there's a lot of evidence that it does have financial impacts.
Yeah, thank you so much. But to give a just small funny anecdote, so I'm one of the old buildings on campus, so actually I'm kind of noticed now that we kind of do some aspects of what you have been talking about. Because, for example, we have a window, so we open it sometimes to smell the rain or just listen to the noises outside. But the building also is so old that if you want to control the temperature in the room, we get a bag of ice and to put in the thermostat to fool it. It's too cold.
I'm so sorry to hear that.
But it's a fun experience.
But I actually think people thinking about ways, if you're not the designer or you can't retrofit or you don't have money, there are ways we inhabit our buildings that we can do things. I mean, if we're going to change our clothing because we're cold or hot in a building, celebrate that. Don't use it, and a lot of it is attitude too. It's like, I'm cold, I have to have a sweater. I'm bringing in my soft, fuzzy fleece blanket that I love, and when I'm cold, it just feels so good, all right? So the attitude we bring to our personal coping behaviors, or to change the way we feel, or to sit next to a window or open a window and reconnect, or to if you're in a noisy environment and people are on the full range of neurodiversity, that could be its own talk, and you're sensitive to things. Maybe people are in a noisy environment and they need to have headphones and listen to quiet music. But the way you do it do it not with an attitude of, I have to fix a problem, but whatever you do, it's like, oh, I like doing this. And attitude really matters. Oh, I know we're at time.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Gail. Thanks. Yeah, here's to mechanical engineers and architecture, right?
Yeah. There's hope.